My name is Zuri Bryant, and I will be the moderator for this session of mental health, the stigma and understanding mental health, the stigma and the importance of mental health in our communities. We have three wonderful authors here that I'll say honestly, over the last few weeks, you've fixed my life. Um, and the way that this session is going to work is I will introduce each of the authors. They will explain to you what they've written. They'll read a little bit of what they've written. Then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open up the questions for the audience. So who should I go? Who goes first? So I'll introduce Jonathan first. So to my far right, I have Jonathan Malesic. Jonathan is an award-winning author who teaches first-year writing at SMU and creative writing at the University of Texas at Dallas, as well as writing workshops. He writes about the ethical and spiritual challenge of living a good life in America today. His expertise covers the meaning and value of work, religion and public life, and higher education. His first book, The Secret Faith in the Public Square, An Argument for the Concealment of Christian Identity, won the gold medal for a religion category in the Forward Indies Book of the Year Awards in 2009. This morning, he'll be reading from his newest book, The End of Burnout, Why Work Drains Us and How to Build Better Lives, which was published by University of California Press in January 22. Jonathan.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so as we've seen over the last couple years, as our work lives have been totally disrupted, burnout has become an important key word for talking about that struggle. And the timing for the release of my book was fortuitous, if it's possible that anything can really be fortuitous at the end of, hopefully, the end of this pandemic, because we're trying to rebuild our lives, and in particular our work lives, and try to figure out, well, how can work be better? And so the book comes out of two things: my own personal experience with burnout, which I'll read a passage about in just a moment, and also my research on the problem of occupational burnout. We talk a lot about burnout in our culture, but we are fairly imprecise, I think, in our discussion of it. And so I researched it. I tried to understand what the problem is, how it connects to our desire for meaning in our work, and then ultimately to look for possible ways beyond burnout. How can we rearrange our society? How can we reorient our ideals? How can we rebuild our lives so that we don't burn out quite so spectacularly at work, and how to find a better place for work in our lives. So what I'm going to read to you right now, talking to people around the country, from monks living in the desert of New Mexico to a nonprofit here in Dallas, whose offices are just a mile or so from where we're sitting, and to artists with disabilities in Finland, and finally, and all of that is to try to find models of living that that are perhaps going to help us resist and overcome burnout. And then finally, at the end of this chapter, I consider myself and my own journey. So that's what this is from. So then there's me. After leaving what had once been my dream job as a college professor, I followed my wife's career to Texas and tried to reassemble my working identity. It was a relief to feel the tension between my ideals and the reality of my job go slack. But I felt lost for much of my first year in the sun-blasted concrete city that was my new home. As a newcomer, I was often asked what I did for a living. I would respond, "I'm a writer?" It felt fraudulent. I kicked around the idea of getting yet another graduate degree or maybe a job in food service just to have a better answer to that question. I spent long days at home, alone, waiting for someone to give me a project. I began to identify with Martin Sheen's character at the beginning of Apocalypse Now, the commando deteriorating in his Saigon hotel room because he didn't have a mission. Slowly, I published more. I went to writing workshops. I charted out a new career that combined writing, speaking, and teaching. I decided I wanted to get back into a college classroom, so I emailed the director of the first-year writing program at a nearby university. She wrote back and asked if we could meet right away. She needed someone to teach a class beginning in just a few weeks. Getting that job was a crucial step toward remaking my ability to flourish. My teaching schedule is light, just 1 or 2 classes a semester, but it imposes a structure on my days and weeks. It gives me an institution to belong to. As an adjunct, I'm on the wrong side of the fissured workplace, but my tenured faculty friends see me as a peer. Most important, I know someone is depending on me. My students rely on me to lead our class meetings, to grade their papers, to show them how to improve their paragraphs' topic sentences. That is immediate daily validation of my labor and time, and thus of myself. I know how risky it is to lean on that validation, but it's nice to hear students thank me as they walk out the classroom door. While I was working on this chapter, I took the Maslak burnout inventory again. I knew I wasn't burned out anymore, but I wanted scientific verification. In the 4 years between the 2 tests, I improved across all 3 dimensions by a surprising amount. Shortly after I quit my job, I scored in the 98th percentile for exhaustion, the 44th for cynicism, and the 17th for personal accomplishment, signaling a high sense of ineffectiveness. The second time around, I scored in the 13th percentile for exhaustion, just the 7th for cynicism, and 55th for personal accomplishment. The new scores accurately reflect my subjective sense of how I'm doing. I'm not exhausted. I wake up and feel fine. I don't dread the tasks ahead of me. Hard work, even the work of writing, which only requires I sit still and alone, is tiring. But I don't feel the constant weariness I did at the end of my full-time teaching career. Teaching takes up little of my time. I have near total autonomy to write what I want. I'm proud of the work I do. Someone who was still burned out could not have written this book. I preach a new vision of work better than I practice it. I'm no good at the moral austerity Thoreau links to greater self-respect. I'm bad at scheduling and get nervous when I think I haven't been productive. I struggle to take Father Simeon's advice and get over it when my work feels undone. I can't stop needing other people to validate me. I haven't picked up a drawing pencil or pulled on my hockey skates in years. Nevertheless, I am much better off than I was in my final years as a professor. And it did take a new austerity to get to this point. In giving up my job and forging a freelance career, I took a 75% pay cut, which would have been impossible without my wife's income. I had to sacrifice the status that comes from having a full-time job, not to mention the academic prize of tenure. I had to give up part of my ego. I had to give up a long-held dream. But I found a new one. I almost hate to admit this because I don't want to gloss over the pain of my burnout. But a part of me is grateful that I burned out as completely as I did. It was a clear signal that something was wrong, that I needed to make a significant change. If the job had been less uncomfortable, I could have persisted in it for much longer, perhaps damaging myself more severely because the harm would have been less perceptible, a slow, inexorable erosion rather than a more spectacular collapse. Seen in this way, burnout can even be a gift. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading. So next we'll go to Kevin. Kevin Dedner serves as founder and CEO of Hurdle, which is a culturally intentional mental health provider that provides a comprehensive suite of mental health services. His company addresses issues of race, ethnicity, and class through training in an evidence-based technique that improves cultural humility and responsiveness. An award-winning public speaker who has led strategic planning processes on behalf of several clients, including the nation's largest public health foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Kevin is a frequent speaker at health and health technology conferences and has self-published a number of essays that document his work in public health and mental health care. The Joy of the Disinherited is his debut book, from which he'll be reading this morning.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Just a few words about the book before I read. My journey in this book started with the acquittal of George Zimmerman. It literally gave me headaches. And I decided to research this question of could being a Black man make me sick? And maybe within 72 hours of digging deep into the literature, I came to the conclusion, yes, it can. And I decided I wanted to write a book about the health of Black men. And in fact, I bought the domain waskillingblackmen.com. If you go to it right now, it directs you to this book site. That's how committed I was to writing the book at that time. But I like to say that I needed to live a few more chapters before I could write the book. When I decided to write the book, I had not experienced depression myself, and I had no idea that I would be leading a mental health company. So at that time, I was working as a consultant, and I worked myself into mental exhaustion, and very much like you. And the exhaustion led to depression, and my depression was arresting. Like I literally couldn't work, couldn't think straight, et cetera, couldn't sleep. And I struggled to find a therapist. And after I found a good therapist, Oliver, who's in the audience, asked me to lunch. And he asked me a question. He said, have you ever considered doing anything in digital health? And that's how I decided to start a company providing therapy with Oliver, I should say. And so I still wanted to write this book, but I just couldn't get a cadence. I couldn't get a rhythm. And obviously I was in therapy. I continued in therapy. And the summer before last, I started journaling. And I also discovered the work of Howard Thurman. And I really recommend, if you read my book, that you also read Jesus and the Disinherited as an accompanying book. And when I was journaling and I found this Howard Thurman's work, it magically came together, and I realized this is how I would write my book. And so the important thing about Thurman's work is Thurman argues that the disinherited are people who are oppressed by the government. He calls it with their back against the wall. And he says that there are three primary ways that the disinherited respond to oppression. Number one, they imitate the oppressor. Number two, they keep a safe distance from the oppressor. And then number three is outright resistance. My book is a collection of essays about me and my family, a family from the antebellum South, and how we have responded to racism and oppression using that construct that Howard Thurman lays out. So again, I recommend Jesus and the Disinherited as an accompanying book because it really provides a lot of insight to my thinking about the book. So I'll read. The passage that I'm going to read, I'm going to start with a journal entry that's literally in the book. But I was looking at Facebook memories last night and realized that this entry was yesterday, 2015. It's been a long time since I have been truly happy, but it feels like I'm on the verge of life coming together again. I have been doing lots of internal work. I have been praying. Sometimes it doesn't feel like God is there, but I have to believe that I am heard. Now, it's another warm Saturday in DC. It is 2015. I am folding white linen napkins, occasionally trimming a loose thread that's untangled itself from the serge edges. I shift my attention to the flower arrangements and fidget with the placement of each vase. Next, I negotiate with a caterer I've hired about the desserts she selected and whether they appropriately complement the evening soul food theme. The cook is here, in my home, to help me cater to an impressive guest list. It is a list that I have curated, pulling from my expanded network of political heavyweights and budding socialites in the Capitol. This is one of many parties I host in the years of my unraveling. This time, it is in honor of my dear friend Rashad Allison, a Little Rock native and a journalist. He has published his first book. It will be his last, though none of us know that now. None of us know that 3 years later, cancer will take him from all of us soon. The guests will be arriving shortly. Each of them knows me, but they do not know that I am on the verge of losing almost everything I have, materially and spiritually. As I look back, I know now that I was building a house of cards, up and up, stacking each symbol of prestige atop another. A dinner party here, a coveted consulting contract there, failing to see the hollowed foundation upon which I was building a prescribed sense of self, until it all came crashing down. I have spent many years of my life, like Ralph Ellison's narrator in The Invisible Man, burning parts of my personhood to see in the dark. I masked inherent character traits when they made a white coworker or investor feel uncomfortable. I attempted to define myself through the values and the expectations that the world, which constantly misunderstood me, imposed on me. To be misunderstood, to relinquish old identities to build new ones is not a unique human experience. Each of us can attest to a time of identity foreclosure, a period in which we relinquish the mystique of our learned personality and disposition. We reevaluate. We examine the whys and the hows of who we are. We narrate our origin stories and edit with hindsight the parts that once eluded us. But for the disinherited, choosing what to become is not inedible. In fact, it often feels like an illusion out of reach. When racism is an obstacle to your development, this evolution is delayed, and in some cases, missed altogether. I have turned many heads at dinner parties when I've offered up my unfiltered version of this observation. Black people often don't know who they are. Like adolescents, we have to take on expectations of how we should behave, how we should talk, how we should resist, and how we should heal. In exchange for a gutted and highly stipulated acceptance into the American fold, we commit to these prescribed identities with fervor. Yet we, the disinherited, are not given an equitable stake in this exploration of self. The roles and the archetypes we are assigned limit our complexities as individuals. We are forced to play inauthentic parts. We are told, on the one hand, that we must work too hard to achieve our dreams, yet in some spaces we are told that certain careers, institutions, and positions are not for us. One day, after carefully constructing my house of cards, having committed everything I had to an articulately designed life, the wind blew just so. And there I was, scattered and false in my sense of self. The beauty of being scattered to the wind is that with the cards laid out before me, one by one, I could decide what was me and what was not. I could let go of identities prescribed to me. I began to explore new identities. I became a truer version of the Black man I wanted to be. 2016 journal entry. I now understand that I am on a journey. I am grateful for the growth. Lord, help me discover more lessons within my experiences. Please use me in your service. Help me to discover my authentic self. Remove all ego from me. Help me to operate in my highest self. There have been many attempts to prescribe the right way to be a Black man in America. Walk from room to room in my home, and the images of my ancestors hanging from the walls will tell you the story of how men in my family went about it. Some of my grandfathers posed stoically next to equally resistant grandmothers, their industry showing through in the details of their attire and in the backdrop of their homestead on the farm. These are the ancestors who worked as sharecroppers and paid help in the antebellum and postbellum South, maintaining a simple and lonely life, limiting their interactions with white people, or any people for that matter. Some ancestors offered the camera a forced smile, most likely after a long day's work in which they adopted the manners and speeches of whites, assimilating under a manufactured guise of belonging. And others, like my father, wear an expression of resistance on their face and in the bold colors of their dress. He is the one who kicked against the system of white supremacy altogether. Although I'm not certain his revolt was a conscious one, and he is the one whose youth is immortalized in photographs. Daddy did not live past his 35th birthdays. One last paragraph. Surrounded by my ancestors, I often feel like Ellis's narrator, a nameless protagonist. I too am obsessed with understanding myself in the shadows of racism and oppression, with my ancestors encased in glass frames and some painted on burlaps, canvas stretched over wooden crossbars. I can bear witness to their passive and audacious interpretations of their place in a broken world. I can see my place in our delicate lineage. On days when I become disillusioned like Ellis's narrator and feel the impossible weight of living in a world that is either blind to my humanity or convinced that I am a threat to society because I am a Black man, I can look back at my father and my grandfathers and remember that I do not have to live in the shadows.
Amen. Thank you for reading. Last but not least, we have Ivan Maisel, who is Vice President, Editor, and Senior Writer at on3.com and has had a 4 decades-long career as a sports writer for many publications, including the Atlanta Constitution, Sports Illustrated, and the Dallas Morning News. He began his 18-year career at ESPN in 2002 as its first college football writer and appeared on ESPN television, radio, and podcasts. Maisel has a host of sports writing accolades. We don't have time to mention them all. That include being presented with the Jake Wade Award for his contribution to intercollegiate athletics. Today, Ivan will be reading from his new memoir, I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye.
Thank you, Zuri, and thank you for being here. Good morning, and it's fascinating to follow John and Kevin just to hear that they have come out the other side. And that's really why I wrote my book. And it was funny that you started in March of 2015. Our son, Max, ended his life in February of 2015. So I'm thinking of where I was when you were down, and I was right down there with you. And because we're talking about resilience, it gets to the heart of why I wrote this book. And it was really not merely to tell you about Max. It was more to having been on the other side of the grief exchange, for lack of a better word. Before Max died, I was terrible at grief, and I was even worse at comforting people who were grieving. Then, having gone through it in such a stark way, and watching people respond to us, I thought, yeah, it's scary, but I don't have a choice. I got thrown into this, and I've got to figure out a way out. And the book is really about how I learned to carry my grief and continue on with my life, because you don't have a choice. You can't stay. I can't stay where Max was. If I stay where Max was, I lose out on what's going to happen. I had a nephew get married 2 weeks after Max's body was recovered. He drowned in Lake Ontario. And if we didn't go to that wedding, then we lose again. We didn't want to go to the wedding. I say we, my two daughters, and my wife and I. We didn't want to go to the wedding, and it was pretty much fake it till you make it. But we went, and and it wasn't terrible, and it was one small step. The passage I'm about to read is how I came to the realization that I really don't have any control over what's going to happen, and it's all about how I respond to it. Particularly to the idea that I have no guarantee that anybody I love, especially our daughters, especially my wife, is going to continue to live the way that we all assume we all are going to continue to live. So with resilience in mind, that's what I'm going to read. In my unguarded moments, when the mental defenses I have developed through years of practice are taking a nap, the existential fears usually quarantined by common sense and rationality come up for air. My plane is going to malfunction. My car will be T-boned at the next intersection. My romaine lettuce is going to incite an insurrection in my body. The rational part of my brain understands that air travel is the safest form of mass transit, that the other driver is all but certainly sober and attentive, and that a good rinsing will protect me from a Caesar salad gone bad. But I have one existential fear that resists rational thought, that has built immunity to the actuarial evidence that my loved ones and I will live long, healthy, productive lives. It is all I can do to keep from screaming in terror that I will lose another child. Consuming does not adequately describe the effect of a child's death. All consuming sounds hollow too. I never felt comfortable with the sentiment voiced to me over and over again that our lives would never be the same. No kidding. Our son died. I'm condensing this chapter. As I have regained my equilibrium and learned how to function day to day again, there remains a Post-it note stuck in the corner of my brain, reminding me that I am not living in the world I used to inhabit, the world where bad things don't happen. Once you get wrenched out of that thinking, it's hard to return to it. I am a reasonably rational person, and that helped me greatly to function after Max died. But once you learn that you're one random act from having your world completely upended, it's easy to become unnerved, unglued, and untrusting in what the future holds. I don't know a lot about Buddhism. In her book, Holy Envy, Barbara Brown Taylor, an Episcopal priest, explains how teaching a college class on the religions of the world helped her better understand her own faith. I remain especially struck by a tenet of Buddhism, the belief, essentially, that we can't control what happens to us, but we do have the power to control how we respond. In the wake of the death of my son, I understand how the idea that we have control over our lives is a story we tell ourselves to get through the day. To put a finer point on it, there is so much of our lives that we don't control. There are so many calamities that could befall us. We make smart choices. We exercise appropriate caution. We floss. We think that's enough to keep us on life's road without potholes. And we get a call from a sheriff in upstate New York saying our vehicle is sitting in the parking lot adjacent to Lake Ontario and Max is nowhere to be found. All those smart choices and all that caution didn't stop all that pain and all those lonely hours. It is baked into fatherhood to believe that I can sweep aside the pain that awaits my daughters as they live their lives. I can't. Like most American dads, I always try to fix the problem. My children are in their 20s, and it took me about that long to figure out the best thing to do is shut up and listen. That makes even more sense when you come to the realization that some problems can't be fixed. They only can be endured. I can understand that the odds are greatly in my favor that they, like I, will awaken tomorrow and continue to live a healthy, vibrant life. But I also understand with piercing clarity that long shots come in. I can't protect my daughters from losing one another to a long shot any more than I could protect my son from the hideous disease of mental illness that caused him to end his life. All I can do is hope and tell myself a story to get through the day. There are 3 ways to approach this realization. One is to live on tenterhooks, fearing every new plane flight, every new car ride, and every new head of lettuce. So many of us live that way through the pandemic. And if nothing else, we discovered that the accompanying stress is no way to go through life. One is to live the way most of us do, ignoring the possibility of catastrophe, continuing to bluster through life, depending on blissful ignorance and the lies that we tell ourselves. I don't want to live with the tension and fear, if not outright terror, that comes with the former. And I have learned my lesson in the latter. That leaves only awareness. That leaves appreciation for what comes, with the understanding that I am guaranteed nothing. It is a precarious perch if one is accustomed to assuming that bad events happen only to others. I have been disabused of that notion. With the pain and education of the last 7 years, I have learned not to take fortuitous events and good outcomes for granted, even if I genuinely believe that I am responsible for their arrival. It is not my desire to sound as if I have evolved to an elevated plane of bliss and gratitude. The loss that my family and I have experienced feels all too real for that. There's a Buddhist parable that stresses that the sorrow, lamentation, and pain in this world arise from clinging. Those who don't cling are happy. Those who don't cling are without sorrow. Perhaps, as the Buddhists say, attachment is suffering, and I am merely wary of being attached to the notion that I am in control. Which brings up a story about my son Max. Quiet by nature and schooled in the arid humor of Bob and Ray, Max sometimes spoke as if he had to pay by the word. His mom had a bumper sticker that read, "Attachment is suffering." That sticker sat on the rear of her car for years. And then one day, as Meg, my wife, as Meg and Max approached the car, Meg realized the sticker was gone. She was upset. "Max, can you believe someone stole that sticker?" she said. Max replied, "Irony."
Thank you for reading. So I'm wondering if the three of you, after reading, can hear the connections that that your books have, and I know it's not lost on any of you how timely each of these books is. And when I said that you fixed my life in the last couple of weeks, I meant that. Like just reading Burnout, I'm not nuts, And then just thinking about the, you two talking about grief, like we've been grieving a lot in these last couple of years. So thanks. But the question I want to ask is, so all of you have suffered from some amount of depression or some degree of depression. Like, was there a thing that happened that let you know that I'm not okay? So, you're going through whatever you're going through. Was there a thing that happened that let you know that you weren't okay and that you needed to do something about it? All of you.
I can start. I mean, I think that, and I think that there are a lot of resonances just even in these passages.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, there wasn't one day where I thought, whoa, something is wrong with, me and my relationship to my career or something like that. It was more just kind of finding myself, a couple things like lying in bed for a long time in the morning and not going to my job. I was a college professor and I had to be, at a specific place and time at some point in the day, but usually not right away. So I could get away with lying in bed for a while, avoiding my job. And as I say in the first sentence of the book, I would lie there watching the video for Peter Gabriel's song "Don't Give Up" over and over again. And I kept wanting to hear that message and believe it, and I couldn't. And I think that was it, realizing, well, wait a minute, this is supposed to be my dream job, and I don't want to go to it. And I'm lying in bed, and so I'll get out of bed and start doing things, and then sometimes have to go back to sleep. So I don't know if it was one day exactly, but that became a pattern, and I realized, yeah, something is very wrong.
You mentioned that song, Kevin. I think there was a song in yours too.
Yeah, it was. And I was thinking about your experience. It's very similar to mine. So I was a consultant, which basically meant that I had figured out how to work maybe 3 or 4 days a week. And then the other 2 days, I did what I wanted to do. And so when you have that type of flexibility like you're talking about, it gets really, really dangerous when you're sort of teetering on depression or unhappiness. And so for me, that moment was I would pull myself together to get my children to school, the carpool, and then I'd come back and go right to bed. And then one of these days, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, and I realized I had been doing that for months, and I had not even tried to work. Like, I had not even tried to get new work. I had not even tried to renew contracts. And I was like, oh, something's really not right here. And that was an aha moment that I realized that I wasn't living in, like, my regular routine. Although I had the flexibility, I was really taking too much flexibility and not doing anything. And the other thing I would just want to mention for Black men, depression often shows up looking a little bit differently. We become very agitated, short-tempered, And so those things were very present for me too. And I write about it in my book. In fact, the last essay is an open letter to my children. And I apologize for how I interacted with them during my depression.
I had a bout with depression about the time I turned 40, which is probably a cliche, for which I apologize. And it was mostly to do with, what I had been doing wasn't working, and that I pushed myself really hard in work. And I had a job I didn't like, and it really ground me down. My wife finally said to me, "You're not right. You need to go talk to somebody." And I did, and I found I had to kiss a couple of frogs, but I found a therapist that I still have a relationship with, and 20 years later, and I went on medication long enough to kind of get me right again. And I'm a big believer in asking for help now, because once I finally did ask for help, I got it. There's no guarantee. My son was on medication and therapy, but didn't work. But it did help me, and it really helps with grief. One of the things I did learn about grief is that you better grieve when you want to grieve, and get it out when you want it to come out. Because if you don't, it's going to come out when it wants to come out. And that may not be convenient to the rest of your life. Because, if you do this, after a while, your arm gets really tired. So I think that's how I dealt with it.
And so in all of your reading, you all mention some, in different ways, some unrealistic expectations of yourself. So do you think that because we have those unrealistic expectations of, and maybe not even of yourself, or just how things are supposed to be, do you think that we are predisposed to burnout or exhaustion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a paradox that, on the one hand, burnout occurs in this gap between your ideals for work and the reality of your job. So your ideals are way up here, and I think that we're culturally conditioned to have extremely high ideals for work, but in many cases, our reality is down here. And in that gap is where burnout occurs. And so on the one hand, I think that to deal with our burnout culture, we need to lower our ideals and expectations. We need to have more realistic expectations. But at the same time, it's only by having certain kind of higher expectations that we're going to get the conditions a little bit better. So it's tough. I mean, we have to simultaneously have realistic expectations while being idealists and recognizing that the conditions that exist are not good enough. And I think that's a tough balancing act. I don't know. It's maybe a kind of idealism for work and society in general, and be motivated to improve those conditions, while at the same time being like, okay, well, things may not always work out day to day. So yeah, I just think it's a very tricky balance.
Kevin, what about you? Do you think that exhaustion is just the thing that's going to happen?
I think that's an interesting question. I come from a family where, I quote Baldwin in the book, "We are a sturdy stock of men." We work hard, and how hard we work and like our grit is a sign of our manhood. And so, you know, you measure people by the level of effort that they put in life. And I think then when you start to achieve, you know, the next goal is always further away. And I think when you couple that with like Western culture of how we're trained to work, I do think that you end up with some unreasonable expectations on yourself. Now, when I look at the person who I aspire to be in my 20s, or even how I was trained to think about how to go about my goals in life, you know, in college and in high school, it was always unreasonable. Looking back now, it was completely unreasonable. But, you know, that was the construct of how I saw myself achieving, and it literally almost destroyed me. So I think many of us live this way. Like we, you know, for people of color, we're told that we have to be twice as good, work twice as hard. By the way, I don't tell my kids that. And I challenge other people, don't tell your kids that. Like, you do your best is always enough. But I think when you have those type of constructs in your head, that is always setting this unreasonable expectation of how you should show up.
And Ivan, I feel like I need to, I don't know, you want to, I was going to say I feel like I needed to change the question for you, but go ahead. And
Well, you're the boss. Go whichever way you want to go.
No, I'm kidding.
I am the grandson of immigrants who made a life over here. You know, were chased out of Eastern Europe, and they believed in hard work, and my father was the same, and mother were the same way. Each had their own business. I remember telling my father when I went to work at Sports Illustrated that I got 4 weeks vacation, and his response was, "If I can do without you for 2 weeks, I can do without you." And that sort of was the example I had, you know, to push myself, and it took me most of my adult life to let go of that, and understand, as Kevin said, that you just do your best, and I still catch myself, you know, straining, you know, trying to reach some standard that I'm the only one that's paying any attention to it. Nobody else is expecting that of me. You know, so it's been a lifelong push. I'm pretty good about it now, but I lapse.
And you say too in your book that you know, losing Max helped you be a better person. Explain that.
Yeah. Well, so I'm more empathetic now. I'm more resilient, and I understand to this point of push. Gotta achieve. No, I don't. It's really, at the end of the day, it's not that important. And I'm just, you know. And the first time I said out loud, "I'm a better person because my son died," I stopped. I mean, I stopped in mid-sentence because I couldn't believe I had said that. But as I spoke to earlier, you know, that's what happened, and it's all about how do you respond. And the fact is, I have responded in a way that I feel like I am better. You know, that I don't take it as seriously, that I do listen more, that I am more empathetic to people, which is a good quality to have in journalism. It just took me a long time to figure it out.
And in some way, you also say that you don't sweat the big stuff anymore, which is awesome. And that statement kind of connects with I think with all three of the books, and I'm going to say it again, you guys fixed me. But I wanted to ask, do you think that our country, I really didn't want to bash America, but do you think that our country perpetuates this these idealized versions, like this, like who we're supposed to be, and at the same time they don't support us? So I'm saying that because of obviously we're talking about mental health, but you mentioned so in talking about work, how work is everything. You are what you do, and that's that's how people introduce themselves. I'm whatever the thing is that I do. And then we're pushed and pushed and pushed to be the greatest thing of what we do. But then if we aren't working, if we are disabled, we're nothing. Does that mean that we're nothing? Does that mean that we aren't worthy of being recognized? Was there a question in there? So does America perpetuate this ideal and then not support us? So that's a yes or no question, but talk about that.
Yeah, I think all the myths that we all grew up with, if they are myths, that this is the land of opportunity, but it's there is a competitive, cutthroat quality to it that a lot of people ascribe to. But there is not. We are just now, as a society, learning that the other side of that argument is the toll that it takes on us, and especially as with the advent of social media and digital media and everything moving so fast, that we do need to pay a lot more attention to mental illness and we're better at it than we used to be as a society. And I would equate it, and equate it in the book to the way our parents' generation dealt with cancer. They didn't, really our grandparents' generation, that they didn't talk about it out loud. And they might not even tell the patient that they had cancer. And you just didn't talk about it. And once we brought it out into the open and through all the resources that this country has and can have at cancer, we've made incredible strides. And we just need to do that with mental health. And we're getting there. We're better at about it than we used to be. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said, and I think part of it is the Western culture industrialization of how we're trained to work, and we saw that an opportunity maybe to unravel a bit of that during the pandemic. And some people will never go back to working the way that they've worked before. Even I'm struggling trying to get people to want to come to the office, so they'd rather stay at home. So I think that that's very true. I think what I tried to do in my book was add another layer to this, in which I even think that the passage I read picks up on this. But the other part of that is when you're sort of forming your identity in the shadow of oppression, in the shadow of racism, like you really have these standards that are impossible to lead up to. And you're sort of code switching all the time. You're dealing with microaggressions in the workplace. And the research shows that over time, for example, small microaggressions equal the equivalent of a traumatic event. So what am I trying to say is, when you're in a workplace and you're having these experiences, and at some point it all adds up. It's sort of like a powder keg at some point waiting to blow. And I think, what I've learned since I've started talking publicly about having experienced depression, most men who I've come in contact with, both white and black, have experienced depression. And most men have sort of done it quietly, silently, not asking for help. They just sort of powered through. And so I just think that, as it relates to mental health, like the pandemic has really revealed more of the urgency of like how we need to rethink and reshape mental health. And I also like to challenge, like, just often we talk about mental health, sometimes people want to only construct it around mental illnesses, but all of us are at risk of having poor mental health as we move into the world. So it might not be that you're diagnosed with a condition, say you're bipolar or something, but just what you're experiencing, the stress of daily life, can take a toll on you. And I think it's important that we begin to reshape it, to frame it, to make sure that everyone is doing things to preserve their own mental health.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that I want to say in response to both your question and to what you've both said so far. But to build on what Kevin was just saying, the depression is perhaps becoming less stigmatized. It's less shameful, and people are more open somewhat now than before. When you think of burnout, not only is it not shameful, it's a point of pride. People are proud to say that they worked so hard that they burned out, which I think points to our, the underlying cultural expectations about what it means to live a good life and to be a good person. And it's hard work in whatever conditions and overcoming obstacles, whatever they are, and overcoming a lack of support and, forging your mark on the world. And that's I think that's a problem. I think that we need to recognize that no, it's not good to burn. I mean, I know in my passage I expressed a certain amount of gratitude for burnout because it told me something was very wrong. And I think that we need to, rather than say, yeah, I worked so hard, I burned bright and I burned out, and I'm just going to find the next thing and continue to achieve. We need to recognize, well, hold on. The fact that this happened to me is a sign that something is wrong. Something was wrong with my work. Something is wrong with our culture, and it needs to change.
Phrase mental health and mental illness, I think as a society, we've always focused on the first word, and we need to focus on the second word. And that's the difference.
I agree.
Yeah, and we're getting there. Not there yet.
All right, I'm going to stop and allow the audience to ask some questions if anyone has them. I have more, but if anyone has anything they'd like to ask, sir.
title of your book?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the title. Well, you know, again, I sort of point back to how Howard Thurman framed the disinherited as a construct. But, you know, through all of my challenges and in life, and then when I look at my family and I think about all that we've experienced as a family, like the pain, the trauma, the oppression, like the obvious mistreatment. And I think about my cousin Arenicia's right there. When we get together on Christmas or, Thanksgiving, or for my grandmother's birthday, who I write about, she's 104, she'll be 105 in April. And there's still so much joy in our family. And so, what I wanted to do is to, talk about the joy of the disinherited. Like, we go through all of this, but yet we still find a way to experience joy and to live joyfully. So that's really the essence of the title, is that there still is joy in spite of all of the pain. And the other thing, Terry, as you were talking, that really stood out to me, I think that we have been practicing mindfulness in ways that have sustained us for many, many years, and we didn't realize that it was mindfulness. So, for example, my grandmother, I can remember in the summers when I'd be at her house, she'll be out hanging clothes on the line, humming a song. That's mindfulness, right? I mean, it is like she literally was, I can see her throwing the sheets across and she'd be humming. And so I think part of the reason I wanted to mention it is because when I talk about mental health, I suggest to all of you all, everyone should have a toolkit of how they manage their mental health. And not all of our toolkits are going to be the same. I wake up every morning, I pray, I meditate, I spend time alone. Some people run, some people exercise, but everyone should have like their own way of making sure that they maintain their mental health.
The health side of it, I agree. Anyone else have a question? Right here in the front.
You might want to take that.
No, I mean, I understand the question and the importance of it. I always give a caveat that I'm not an expert in mental health. I'm an expert in one case of mental health, that didn't turn out so well. But I think it's just the importance of finding a language, just getting them to talk and to acknowledge their fears and that's okay. And that's really hard to do with boys because they're always trying to be men faster than they are. But I don't really have an answer as to what that language is. It's just figuring a way to get them to communicate and to talk.
Yeah, I would just say, I think all of us need the invitation to see ourselves in the world, like to reflect on how the world sees us and how we see ourselves. And what I hope my book is an invitation to people to look at like how they're forming their identity. And particularly for the young men that you're talking about, there becomes another layer to the question, is how are you forming your identity in the shadow of oppression, in the shadow of racism? Who are you? Who do you want to be? Most young men are not given the invitation to do that. But the moment that they're given the invitation, it is literally as a light goes off, right? And now you can see yourself in the world and you can realize that maybe the identity that has been prescribed to you is not an identity that you really want. And I actually write about this in my book. There's a passage where I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and there's some folks from Little Rock in the audience. And in the mid-90s, we had raging gang wars. And for the early part of my adolescence years, I was teetering. I did everything that today I should have a criminal record, possibly even a felony, right? But I had an experience that I write about, and that one experience gave me an invitation to see myself and see that I did have options. So I think that what you're talking about is super important, and whether or not people go this way or that way could literally be a simple invitation to see to question how they're being prescribed to show up in the world.
The gentleman in the back.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I'll point back to Howard Thurman. When I discovered Howard Thurman, he talked about like to find the truest version of yourself, you have to perform a surgery on your psyche. And he goes on to say, with the precision of a surgeon, like you're literally cutting away at what you've been told about who you are, how you should show up, which sounds like that's a common theme here that we're talking about today. And I think for Black people, this is really hard work. And I've also been thinking about it. Is sometimes it feels like it's a privilege because it requires space to sit quietly, and most people have to go to work. Their days are very prescribed, so like being able to sit and to examine, why you believe what you believe, what conversations you heard when you were young cement like how you move in the world and how you interact in the world are super important. In my book, I talk a lot about my grandmother, Ella Mae, and Aranisha and I. We grew up visiting my grandmother worked for the same white family for 40 years as their maid. My grandfather was their foreman on their farm. And we never went through Miss Albright's front door. So when you have an experience like that as a child, it cements how you think you should interact with white people. And until you start to realize that, you'll be governing yourselves based on that experience when you were young. So I think that this is super important work. I think it is a part of, for Black people in particular, it is a part of our healing. Like whether or not we can make the space to have this type of deep reflection, internal reflection, is, could change the trajectory of our families for years. So, Patrick, I appreciate the question because I think it really hits at the heart of what I'm trying to encourage people to do through my book, is to go deep. And it may be painful. And the thing we know about trauma is you have these experiences and you think you're like putting them away in a closet. That's not true. Like they're always there. They're governing your behavior. By the way, Oprah has a book out with a psychologist named Bruce Perry, and it's called What Happened to You. And they really cement the evidence of what I'm talking about in their book. Their book is much more academic than my book, but they cement this because these experiences we have continue to govern our behavior throughout the rest of our lives, lest we sit with them and deal with them head on.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to end. That's our time.
Oops.
Don't oops. Can we give them a hand? And I think the books are the books here downstairs?
Can I say something? My book didn't make it downstairs, but there are 2 books that are floating in the audience. And if you give me your business card, I'm going to do a raffle to give away the 2 books that are floating in the audience. But I also put some cue cards out because the book didn't make it.
And I think the other books are here for sale, so get them. They're awesome, and they fixed me. And thank you again for being here. Appreciate you.